passing the buck
Your
than coming
time
clean.
has expired. Senator Rennick.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. And of course, this motion, this matter of public importance, is typical Labor. It's all about playing the man and not the facts. And I just want to touch on Senator O'Neill's comments about the bushfires. I mean, that was one of the most egregious displays of political partisanism I've ever seen. State governments are responsible for national parks. They're responsible for foreign emergency services. They're responsible for zoning. Okay, a lot of these fires, and can I add, in 2009, when 180 people died in Victoria on Black Saturday, you didn't see the federal coalition, who was in opposition at the time, blaming Kevin Rudd for the bushfires. Okay, because it was a state issue that basically all the things that deal with bushfires. I mean, obviously these things are going to happen in Australia at the best of times, or the worst of times, when you've got a dry summer. But to make a political partisan point out of this, when the responsibility lied with the state governments and anyone that's from the bush, and you know, I do a lot of mountain biking, national parks and hiking, all that sort of stuff. You could see the undergrowth rise, and I know in my home state of Queensland, the Queensland state government's banning beekeepers from keeping their bees in national parks. Right now, you might go, big deal. What's that got to do with the management of national parks? Because those beekeepers keep the fire trails open. Okay, so there's a lot of issues, and it's well known that the state government's allowing houses and that to be built in flood zones, in fire zones, and it's well known that there's been cuts across all state governments. I'm not picking on sides here in terms of parties. There's been a cut to spending on fire and emergency services, especially when you consider the amount of residential development that's going on near state forests. And I happen to live in a part of Brisbane where I've got an open block on acreage, but I go and drive back into town, and I think to myself, if a match ever goes off in here, some of those houses, I don't know why they're allowed to be there. But the next thing it's funny, the other thing I want to pick up Senator O'Neill on is the public interest point, because that's exactly what the Auditor-General said to me last week in the replies to questions on notice when I've asked for documentation of minutes of meetings that the Auditor-General had with staff from the Department of Infrastructure over the Leppington Triangle purchase. And funnily enough, he's claimed public interest. He doesn't want to give me the documentation, which is a little bit of the pot calling the kettle black, because at the end of the day, he's criticised the Morrison government for not keeping documentation, but he himself doesn't want to give the documentation. I mean, isn't audits all about transparency? So why won't the Auditor-General come clean on his own record-keeping? I've also put that question to him over the car park, so I'm going to look forward to see if he's got any documentation he wants to hand over on that, because as a senator who sits in a House of Review, a bureaucrat shouldn't be trying to cover up documentation if it exists. I mean, there's a question whether it exists at all. Some people might think that he didn't interview anyone from the Department of Infrastructure before he referred it to the police, given that he didn't really refer to any meetings in his audit report, and nor did he refer to any meetings with the Australian government solicitor about the due diligence process. Now, given that I've read those papers that got released last week, it was referred to a number of times that there were meetings with the Australian government solicitor. Don't you think the Auditor-General would have spoken with the Australian government solicitor? But it appears that he didn't. So there's a real question of negligence when it comes to this Auditor-General. And as someone who's got almost 30 years in finance, let me tell you, the audit work that he's done on the value of the Leppington Triangle was the worst work I've ever seen. Blind Freddie, anyone that knows their accounting standards, AASB 13, paragraph 29 to 31, knows that you have to value land at best use, regardless of intent. And you've got to, and if you take in the valuation standards, they say you've got to consider future potential value. I mean, this stuff isn't difficult to understand, but I'll get over onto the issue of today, of course, which is COVID. And of course, we hear that somehow the Morrison government is passing the buck. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, because I've got in front of me here a national partnership on COVID-19 response that was agreed to at the start of the COVID outbreak. And on page 4, in paragraphs 20A, financial arrangements, the Commonwealth has agreed to an upfront advance payment of $100 million to the states to be paid on a population share basis. So straight away, the federal government has put in $100 million to state health. And then on top of that, they've agreed for hospital service payments, the Commonwealth will provide a 50% contribution for costs incurred by states through monthly payments. for diagnosis and treatment of COVID-19, including suspected cases. Now, given that health isn't the responsibility of the federal government, we're constantly reminded by Labor that quarantine and vaccination isn't the responsibility of state governments. It's amazing how the states and Labor never want to acknowledge the contribution made by the federal government in helping them deal with COVID. It would be nice to get a little bit of recognition for a change from the Labor Party, rather than playing partisan politics when we should all be working together on this. This is a gross hypocrisy if you compare the treatment of the COVID pandemic to the treatment of the swine flu pandemic in 2009. Nicola Roxton, the then Health Minister, was told basically by the experts to shut the country down then. She ignored that advice. She said we can't shut the country down. But you didn't see the coalition trying to stir up hysteria and terrify everyone for the sake of making a few political points. And I'll finish up on overarching arrangements in the COAG agreement of the state public health payments. The Commonwealth will provide a further 50% contribution for costs incurred by states through monthly payments for other COVID-19 activity undertaken by state public health systems for management of the outbreak. So the Commonwealth has been making an enormous contribution to the financial costs of dealing with COVID-19, which is, as a state responsibility. And because not only do we have a COVID crisis in this country, we have a health crisis. It's interesting. If you look at the funding that's been given to state governments, the health funding that's been given to state governments since the coalition came to power in 2013, it has increased from $13 billion to $26 billion. It has increased by 100% in 8 years. That is double-digit growth year on year. And despite that, the state governments are saying they need more time to get their hospital systems up to speed, etc., etc., etc. Well, you know what? It's interesting. If you go and look at the Australian Institute Health and Welfare figures, the decline in the number of beds per 1,000 people since 1980 has been shocking. In 1980, the number of beds per 1,000 people was 6.4 beds per 1,000 people. By 2017-18, which is the last year available at the moment, it is down to 3.6. It is down to 3.6 beds per population. So, in other words, if you assume that the population of Australia has increased a little bit over double since 1980, and the number of beds is almost halved, it's down by about 43%, state governments have hardly added any beds to the hospital system and the health system since 1980. I mean, this is gross underfunding by state governments. And I'll point out another thing about Toowoomba and this whole Wellcare issue as well. I know Toowoomba quite well, having went to school there and being my hub from Chinchilla. The Toowoomba-based hospital is in dire need of a $2 billion upgrade. That's why we couldn't put a quarantine centre there, because there wasn't a Tier 1 hospital. Now, the good people of Toowoomba deserve a Tier 1 hospital, but of course the Queensland State Labor government, because they've been in power for the best part of 30 years, has failed to put that $2 billion into the upkeep of the Toowoomba General Base Hospital. And it doesn't end there. We've got hospital ramping increasing big time. We just read in the Courier Mail last night how a lady had to wait 9 hours for an ambulance. 9 hours. 9 hours. And I can relate to that, because when my mum had a stroke in Chinchilla after being a nurse herself for 40 years, it took her 18 hours to get her to Brisbane, 280 kilometres away. And then there's the other issue of the closure of maternity wards. 40 maternity wards have closed in Queensland in the last 30 years under the Labor government. I mean, this is the party that claims to protect women, and yet they're shutting maternity wards in the regions down, faster than what the funding is. And I mean, a lot of these towns are a lot bigger than they used to be. And let's talk about vaccines, finish off on vaccines. I've got an article here. The World Health Organisation came out in September last year, and they said that they didn't expect vaccines to be available by mid-2021. They said the phase 3 of the testing must take longer because we need to see how truly protective the vaccine is, and we need to see how safe it is. So suddenly, once Joe Biden's elected, suddenly the vaccines are available. But the point of the matter is with Pfizer, it's an mRNA vaccine. It is a new technology. There hasn't been the manufacturing hubs available to export this. And interestingly enough, I've got another article from Reuters here. Pfizer begins exporting US-made COVID vaccine to Mexico. That was 29th of April. In other words, the US didn't even start exporting Pfizer vaccines until late April this year. And somehow those opposite us are running around with, allegations made by Norman Swan, unfounded allegations, that somehow we were going to have $40 million available to us at the start of this year. Where do these guys make this stuff up?
Senator
So if anyone's got a...
Your time has expired.